On a dusty street in Potchefstroom, a little girl watched an entire neighborhood disappear in a single afternoon. One order from a white official, a few signatures on papers she could not read, and suddenly homes were torn down, carts piled high, with furniture, and people who had been allowed to exist there yesterday were illegal today. She was too young to understand the language of the law, but she understood one thing with a clarity that cut deeper than any word. If you were black in South Africa, your life could be erased at someone else's convenience. That girl's name was Josie Mpama, and the people who destroyed her world that day would spend the rest of their lives trying and failing to control her. For decades, Josie's voice would shake past offices and police stations, echo through crowded township streets and smoke-filled meeting rooms. She would become one of the first black women leaders in the Communist Party of South Africa, a strategist of strikes, a builder of organizations, a quiet architect of resistance. But before she was any of that, she was a child, watching adults whisper that it was better not to be noticed, not to make trouble, not to be remembered. Josie learned very early that being invisible was supposed to be the safest way to survive. What no one could guess was that invisibility would become the most dangerous weapon she ever used. She was born in 1903, in a country already twisted by racial lines that sliced through streets, schools, wages, and futures. Potchefstroom was a small town, but it sat like a pressure point in the Transvaal, where white farmers, black workers, and British officials moved around each other in a permanent state of collision. Josie's family moved in the cracks between these worlds, classified in ways that bureaucrats argued about. Native, colored, non-European. They lived in a space where your name, your skin, even your accent could change which door you were kicked out of, or whether you were allowed to knock at all. Her father worked odd jobs. Her mother took in laundry and cooking when she could. The house was small, its walls thin, but the sounds that seeped through them were thick with information. Men complaining about a new pass requirement, women calculating how to stretch a single coin over days, cousins discussing rumors that a friend's son had been beaten for not stepping off the pavement fast enough. Josie listened. She watched her mother negotiate with traders, never begging, always insisting, her voice firm but cautious. She watched her father return home, with shoulders tired from work and from humiliation. He never spoke aloud. She saw what silence did to people, how it twisted them inward. And yet, in the evenings, when adults allowed themselves a moment of honesty, the room would heat up with quiet fury. So they say we must carry another pass now. We must move again. They say this is a white area now. White yesterday, black yesterday, but now they change their minds, and our lives must move with their pen. They think we are dogs. No, dogs are treated better. Josie sat at the edge of those conversations, pretending to play, pretending not to understand, but the words stuck like barbs. School was brief and precarious. Black children's education, when it existed, was designed to keep them in their place, to teach just enough to follow orders and not enough to question them. Josie discovered books almost by accident. A discarded spelling primer, a Bible with pages missing, a second-hand reader. She stumbled through sentences, sounding out letters, forcing meaning to appear where the system had decided it was not necessary for her. Reading was her first rebellion. In those pages, she found worlds that refused to stay inside fences. She also found something else. Proof that those who controlled the words controlled the story. That those who wrote the laws wrote reality. If she could read, she could push back. But literacy did not pay rent. As soon as she was able, Josie went to work. Like so many young black women, she became a domestic servant in a white household, an invisible presence who cleaned the floors, cooked the food, and learned, up close, just how easily the people who ruled her life lied to themselves. They called her girl, even as she carried responsibilities heavier than each of their children. They spoke of our native with an indulgent kindness that made her teeth clench. They could discuss politics and wages and the native problem over dinner while she moved around the table, silent, their words landing on her like dust that never washed off. It was in that house that she first met her competitor. He was not a politician yet. He wasn't even a man she spoke to directly. He was the eldest son of the family she worked for, a young white man home from university, full of theories, full of certainty. At night, when his friends came over, they stood on the veranda, beers in hand, talking about Africa as though it were a field they were planning to plow. "We need order," her employer's son insisted. "These people must be controlled. If you don't keep them in their place, they will overrun everything. It's just practical. Someone has to lead, someone has to be strong enough to make the hard decisions." From the shadows of the kitchen doorway, Josie listened, the words searing themselves into her memory. She watched the way his friends nodded, how they liked his confidence, how easily they accepted that leadership belonged to him purely because of his race, his schooling, his access. He didn't know it, but that night, he became the shape of something Josie would fight for the rest of her life. A competitor who believed power was his birthright, who saw organizing and control as a game he was born to win. It would take years before their paths crossed in ways both direct and symbolic, but the rivalry began there, in the unspoken space between a white man, confidently planning a future he assumed he owned, and a black woman silently deciding she would rather burn that future down than live in it on his terms. Josie's own future seemed suffocatingly narrow. Long hours of domestic work, constant vulnerability to insults, to dismissal, to violence, the constant danger of the past system tightening its grip, of new regulations appearing overnight. She saw other women around her accept this as the natural order of things, not because they were weak, but because there was no visible alternative. The first twist in Josie's story came from an unexpected place, the street outside the house where she worked. One evening, on her way back to her tiny room in the servants' quarters, she heard raised voices from around the corner. Not the drunk shouts she was used to ignoring, but something different, organized, rhythmic, dangerous. A small crowd had gathered, men and women, some in work clothes, some still in aprons and overalls, stood listening to a speaker on a crate. He was talking about past laws, about wages, about the right to walk in your own city without permission. "They make us carry their papers," he said, holding up a crumpled pass that the crowd hissed at. "They make us prove we exist every day. But what if we make them see us in another way? What if we organize? What if we refuse?" Josie stopped dead. For a moment, the fear drilled into her, since childhood shouted that this was not her place, that just standing at the edge of that crowd was already a risk. Police patrols were never far. Meetings like this were watched, broken up, punished. Her heart beat so loudly she could feel it in her teeth, but she stayed. The speaker mentioned a word she had only heard as a whisper before. Communists. He spoke of workers in other countries, people who had stood up to bosses, who had refused to accept wages that starved their children, while factories made fortunes. Communism, trade unions, collective action. The words were heavy, unfamiliar, and yet they felt like something she had been waiting for without knowing it. It was as if someone had finally drawn a map on a piece of paper that until that moment had only been filled with scribbles. After the crowd dispersed, Josie lingered near the back, watching a handful of people gather around the speaker. They spoke quickly and quietly, handing each other bits of paper, setting times, naming places. "We're meeting on Sunday by the mine dumps," she heard. "Bring whoever you trust." That night, back in her small, cramped room, Josie didn't sleep. She stared at the cracked ceiling and heard again the young white man on the veranda talking about keeping them in their place. She set his voice against the man on the crate, explaining that their place did not have to be the one assigned to them. She realized she stood on a knife edge. On one side, obedience, silence, the narrow path of survival as others defined it. On the other, risk, exposure, the possibility of losing even the little she had. The possibility that any wrong move could lead to prison, beatings, or worse. But there was another time limit ticking loudly in her mind, one she had never named until that night. It was the countdown to becoming too tired, too scared, too used to injustice to fight it. The countdown to waking up one day and realizing that her anger had been replaced by resignation. If she didn't step forward now, she might never step forward at all. On Sunday, she went to the meeting. The mine dumps were a landscape out of a nightmare. Mountains of waste rock, fine dust that coated everything, the skeleton of an economy, built on other people's backs. Men and women gathered in the shadow of these artificial hills, scanning for police, keeping conversations low but intense. Someone passed around a piece of paper for names. Someone else watched the road. It was there that Josie began to understand that politics was not the distant, abstract thing discussed in her employer's drawing room. Politics was here, in the way the police could decide whether today you went home or to jail, in the way a pass law could separate husbands and wives, in the way a white foreman could decide whether you ate that week. It was also there that she heard for the first time that there was already a party in South Africa that called itself communist, that spoke openly against racial segregation and capitalism, that claimed the struggle of black workers as its own. The Communist Party of South Africa was small, fragile, watched, but it existed, and it was looking for people brave or desperate enough to stand with it. Josie listened to the organizers explain how meetings were arranged, how leaflets were printed and smuggled into factories, how rumors had to be countered with facts, how fear had to be met with organization. They spoke about strikes in other countries, about revolutions that had toppled empires, about how even the most solid-looking regimes could crack if enough people pushed in the same place. It was terrifying. It was addictive. She started attending more gatherings, always at night, always looking over her shoulder. She learned to memorize addresses and meeting times instead of carrying incriminating scraps of paper. She heard stories of arrests, of beatings, of comrades banned from cities they had grown up in. She saw faces disappear from meetings and felt each absence like a stone in her stomach. But she also watched something else grow, a network of solidarity that crossed the artificial racial boundaries the government insisted were natural and permanent. In the cramped rooms where communists and workers met, Africans spoke alongside Indians. Colored activists planned with white radicals. The unity was imperfect, full of arguments and suspicion, but it was real. For a young black woman who had grown up being told that politics belonged to white men, it was nothing short of electrifying. Not everyone in the movement welcomed her. Some men, even those who preached equality, thought women belonged in the background, making tea, typing documents, never at the front of the room. Josie felt their eyes on her when she asked questions, when she challenged an argument, when she suggested a different tactic. In those moments, she recognized a familiar shape, the same entitlement she had seen on the veranda in her employer's house, now dressed in working-class clothes and revolutionary rhetoric. Here, too, there were competitors. Some of them were comrades, honest men, shaped by a world that told them leadership looked a certain way. Some, however, were more dangerous, ambitious organizers who saw the movement as their stage and who viewed any strong voice, especially a woman's, as a threat. The rivalry sharpened her. Every time someone tried to push her to the edge of the room, she learned how to step back into the center. Every time her suggestion was ignored, then repeated by a man and applauded, she learned how to speak in a way that could not be easily stolen. She began to understand that the struggle was not only against the state that wanted to crush them, but also against the habits that the state had bred into their own thinking. The fight was against racism and capitalism, yes, but also against the small, daily betrayals that could weaken a movement from within. By the late 1920s, Josie was no longer just an observer. She had joined the Communist Party. She was helping to distribute leaflets, to organize house meetings, to connect women workers who, like her, were supposed to be invisible. She discovered that women had their own networks, informal, quiet, powerful. They shared news in queues, in kitchens, at water pumps. They warned each other about police raids, about new pass requirements, about which employers were dangerous. They organized savings clubs, childcare, emergency support for families whose breadwinners had been arrested. Josie began to weave those networks into the political structures she was learning. She didn't ask permission, she simply did it. And that was when the authorities started to notice her. Pass inspections suddenly became more frequent in places she visited. Strangers lingered just a little too long at the edge of meetings. Once, after a small gathering in a back room, she stepped outside and found a policeman staring directly at her, his eyes cold, his smile thin. "You talk too much," he said quietly as he checked her pass. "Careful your tongue doesn't get you sent somewhere far away." The warning was not idle. Josie knew what had happened to others. Banishment, prison, being declared a prohibited person in your own city. But fear, which once would have paralyzed her, now did something else. It clarified her priorities. The regime was not going to slow down. New controls, new passes, new evictions, they were all coming, some already here. Her life, like the lives of millions around her, was being squeezed into a smaller and smaller space. The time to choose between survival and resistance was running out. She refused to choose. She would find a way to survive by resisting. The countdown had started. On the morning they came to arrest her, Josie was not afraid of the handcuffs. She was afraid of the stamp. The policeman's fingers hovered over the thick rubber stamp on the desk, the one that turned people into shadows with a single word: banned. Once it hit the paper, your name no longer belonged to you. Your body could not cross certain streets, could not stand in certain rooms, could not speak to certain people. You became a ghost in your own life. Josie stood very still, wrists already bruised from the metal biting into her skin, watching the stamp as if it were a weapon aimed at her chest. Then the officer moved aside, and another man stepped forward to sign the order. She recognized his face before her mind had time to give it a name. The confident jawline, the neatly parted hair, the easy arrogance of someone who never had to worry about a pass, a raid, a midnight knock, her employer's son. The young man who used to talk about keeping them in their place on the veranda, beer in hand. Now he wore a suit and the weight of state authority like a tailored coat. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. A flicker of confusion crossed his face. She could see him trying to place her, another native woman in custody, another name in a file. But somewhere, deep in his memory, a servant in the shadows stirred. He frowned. She smiled, very slightly. He signed. The stamp came down. The paper shook. To understand how she ended up in that room with her rival holding the pen that tried to erase her, you have to go back to the moment when the countdown stopped being a feeling and became a date on a calendar. It was 1929 when the rumor turned into a notice. African women in Potchefstroom would be required to carry special passes, lodges, permits and service contracts that had to be produced on demand. Without them, any woman could be arrested, fined, or forced out of town. For years, passes had stalked African men. little books that controlled where they could live, when they could work, how long they could stay in a city. The system broke families, filled prisons, and kept wages low, but women had been spared the worst of it. Not out of mercy, but out of laziness. The state focused on the bodies it needed for the mines and factories first. Now it wanted the women too. The notice was simple, printed in lifeless language. It might as well have read, "By this date, by this hour, you will accept that we own not just your labor, but your movement, your motherhood, your very existence in this town, or we will crush you." The deadline, 3 weeks, 21 days for Josie and the women around her to decide whether they would quietly stand in line for passes or whether they would refuse. The men in the party argued in cramped rooms, thick with smoke. "We are not ready," said one. "We don't have enough organizers. A confrontation now could destroy us." "If we let this pass," another countered, "they will know we can be pushed as far as they like. When will we ever be ready?" But underwater, where the system rarely looked, another conversation was already taking shape. In kitchens, at water pumps, behind market stalls, women didn't need to debate the meaning of the law. They felt it in their bones. A pass for a woman meant a pass for every child trailing her skirts. It meant a husband could be arrested because his wife's papers weren't in order. It meant every step through the city would be taken under the gaze of a hostile state. Every knock on a doctor's door, every trip to a shop. They had 21 days to stop that from becoming normal. Josie moved like a spark through dry grass. From house to house, yard to yard, she knocked, entered, sat on upturned crates and thin mattresses. She spoke to women who had never been to a political meeting, never heard the word communist, never read a pamphlet, but who understood. Immediately, the feeling of someone reaching into their lives with cold fingers. "They want us to carry the papers that will choke us," she told them. "They want to turn us into our own jailers." Some women were wary. "We have children," one said, eyes flicking to the doorway as if the law itself were listening. "They are counting on that," Josie replied. "They think our fear will keep us quiet, but if we accept this now, what will our children have left? A life spent begging to stay where they were born?" Others didn't need persuading. Their anger had been waiting for a match. "Let them come take us," a market seller snapped, knotting her headscarf tighter. "We will not help them with their chains." Josie wrote nothing down. Names, addresses, meeting times, all of it stayed in her head. She understood that every scrap of paper could be used against them. The very skills she had learned to resist the state, reading, writing, could now feed its hunger for information. So she turned herself into a living ledger. At the same time, in an office not far from where she moved through backyards, her competitor studied the problem from the opposite side. He had grown older, polished by university halls and government training. He'd read thick reports on native administration, on urban influx control, on the danger of communism. For men like him, the world unfolded as a neat set of charts and categories. He traced a finger down a list of numbers. African women in Potchefstroom, estimated. He looked at diagrams showing reserves and locations. He read memos warning that communists were agitating among non-European women. He smiled. "If we can bring the women under past control," he wrote in his neat hand, "we can effectively regulate entire households. This is not simply about order. It is about shaping a reliable labor force and preventing political infection." He did not know the name of the woman who was already organizing against him. To him, she was part of a mass, an ink stain on a map, a statistic in a column. He was about to discover what happened when a statistic picked up a megaphone. The protest was set for the day before the passes were to be issued. There was no time for printed banners or detailed plans. There was only word of mouth, trust, and the raw urgency of the countdown. Women were told, "Do not go to the offices for passes. Come to the square instead. Bring your anger, bring your neighbors. Leave your fear at home if you can. On that morning, men gathering for work stopped and stared. Women poured into the street. Domestic servants in faded aprons, barefoot hawkers, washerwomen with their hands still red from lye, wives of municipal laborers, teenage girls who should have been in badly funded classrooms, all converged on the heart of Potchefstroom. Some carried the old passes and permits they already hated on behalf of their husbands and sons. Others carried nothing but their voices. "No passes for women," they shouted. "We will not carry passes. We will not be driven like cattle." Josie moved inside the crowd. Not at its front, not yet. She knew this was bigger than one person. But when the first line of police appeared, rifles bobbing, batons swinging at their sides, someone had to step forward. She felt the eyes of the women around her, the weight of their expectation, of their shared risk. If she stopped now, the fear that had driven them out of their houses could turn into something worse. Shame. She stepped out of the safety of numbers and stood where the police could see her clearly. The officer in charge looked at her as one might assess a stray dog. Annoying, possibly dangerous in a pack, certainly not worth a name. "You are breaking the law," he barked. "Go home. If you do not disperse, we will arrest you." "This is our home," Josie answered, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. "We are not children. We will not be chased away from our own streets." A murmur ran through the crowd. Behind the officer, a plainclothes administrator watched from the side, hat pulled low, lips thin. His job was to observe, to note troublemakers, to suggest appropriate measures later. If Josie had turned her head at that precise moment, she might have seen him, the once lazy student of the veranda, now a careful recorder of defiance. But the distance between them was still measured in roles, not in recognition. The officer gave the signal. The police moved. What followed was not the glorious charge of a storybook uprising. It was panic. The sickening thud of wood on bone, the crack of shots fired into the air, the high, thin cries of women who had never imagined themselves facing rifles for daring to refuse a piece of paper. Some ran, some stood frozen, some fell. Josie did not run. A baton struck her shoulder, sending a spike of pain down her arm. Hands grabbed her, rough and practiced. She heard her name being screamed, "Josie!" But the sound came from far away, as if underwater. When the chaos settled, dozens of women were in custody. Their crime was refusing to make it easier for the state to control them. In the holding cell, the air was thick with dust and fear. Some women sobbed quietly, others stared ahead, jaws clenched. They knew what prison could mean. Lost jobs, lost income, children left to fend for themselves. Josie felt the bruise blooming on her shoulder and the weight of their eyes on her. "Is this what you wanted?" one woman asked bitterly. "For us to be locked up?" Josie could have flinched. Instead, she breathed in slowly, tasted the sourness of the cell, and answered. "No," she said. "I wanted them to be afraid of what would happen if they tried to chain us. They answer with violence because they are afraid. That fear is our proof that we are not powerless." A snort of disbelief met her words. "Afraid? They have guns. We have nothing." Josie looked around the cell, at the cluster of bodies, at the fists tightened in anger, at the bruises that would bloom like dark flowers by morning. "We have something," she said quietly. "We have each other, and we have shown them that we can say no. That seed is already in the ground. They can beat us, but they cannot unplant it." It was a small comfort, but in a system designed to erase all hope, even a small comfort was an act of rebellion. The trial came quickly. The courtroom was a theater of hierarchy. A white judge on a raised bench, white officials at clean desks, black women crowded onto hard benches, their clothes still bearing the stains of everyday labor and yesterday's chaos. The charges were read out in a voice so bored it almost sounded sleepy. public disturbance, incitement, refusal to obey lawful orders. Lawful. The word hit Josie like a slap. Lawful was what had demolished her neighbors' homes when she was a child. Lawful was the pass system that turned men into criminals for walking down the wrong street. Lawful was the new demand that women carry passes too. Lawful was simply whatever those in power could enforce. When it was her turn to speak, the judge did not look up at first. To him, she was one of many, interchangeable. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" he asked, already arranging his features into the expression of mild contempt he reserved for native agitators. Josie stepped forward, feeling the weight of that question twist in her stomach. In her defense, she thought of defending herself, of pleading for mercy, of asking for leniency on behalf of the women who had followed her and now sat terrified behind her. Then she remembered the stamp. Defending herself would mean accepting the rules of a game designed to crush her. She lifted her chin. "I did not come here to defend myself," she said, voice steady. "I came to accuse." A rustle went through the courtroom. Somewhere, a clerk paused, pen hovering. "The law you speak of is not justice," Josie continued. "It is a tool built to choke us. You say we disturb the peace. What peace? The peace of hunger? The peace of families torn apart by passes? If that is your peace, then yes, we disturbed it, and we will do so again." The judge's face hardened. 6 months hard labor, he said through clenched teeth, almost before she had finished, "and after that, you are prohibited from residing in Potchefstroom or its location without special permission. Banished." The word fell like a stone into the pit of her stomach. Potchefstroom was not just a town. It was memory, history, network. The streets she knew blindfolded, the women who trusted her, the colleagues she had grown with in the party. To be told she could not legally live there was a different kind of sentence, one that tried to cut her off from her roots. From the back of the courtroom, a man watched, lips thinly pressed together. The administrator, the competitor. It was not his signature that sent her to prison, that belonged to the judge, but it was men like him who advised, who recommended, who designed the policies that made such sentences routine. He made a note in his file. Mpama, Josephine, communist, dangerous agitator among native women. Recommend close surveillance and restriction of movement. He underlined dangerous. For him, that word was an achievement. For her, it was a confirmation that she had stepped fully into the arena he believed was his alone. Prison stripped away illusions, but not resolve. Hard labor meant early mornings, blistered hands, the constant scraping of shovels and brooms against concrete. It meant guards who enjoyed their small powers and who understood that breaking bodies was one way to keep order. But it also meant something the state had not intended. Time. Time to talk. Time to share stories. Time to knit together a tapestry of oppression that stretched far beyond Potchefstroom. Women from different towns, different backgrounds, different struggles ended up crushing stones side by side. They compared notes on pass raids, on land seizures, on wages that shrank while prices rose. They shared rumors of resistance in other places, of strikes, boycotts, quiet sabotage. One woman described how, in her village, they had refused to pay a new tax by simply disappearing into the fields whenever collectors approached. Another spoke of a workers' committee in a factory that accidentally spoiled a batch of goods by following instructions too literally. They laughed, even as they worked, until their muscles screamed. The state thought it was punishing them. It was, in some ways, but it was also cramming experience and anger into a pressure cooker. Josie listened, asked questions, connected patterns. Her mind, forced to slow its movement through the outside world, sped up internally. She realized something vital. Potchefstroom was not unique. The mechanisms grinding down her community were the same ones grinding down communities across South Africa. The pass laws, the taxes, the forced removals, they were pieces of a single machine. If that machine could be understood, it could be attacked. Prison did not break her. It refined her. When she was released, thin but unbowed, she stepped out into a world that had moved on without her, but not in the way the authorities had hoped. The women of Potchefstroom had not given in quietly. Some had been cowed by the arrests and beatings, yes. Others, however, had taken the shock and turned it into steel. They had met again, cautiously, in back rooms and church halls. They had written letters to newspapers, some of which were published, others of which disappeared mysteriously before reaching their destination. They had learned something the regime could not unteach them, that passes were not inevitable. But Josie could not join them openly. The ban order lay on a desk in a government office, stamped and signed, waiting to be enforced. If she stayed, she would constantly risk rearrest. And this time, the sentence could be longer, harsher, exiled to a remote rural area where her networks would be frayed thin. So she did something that would haunt her and save her at the same time. She left home. Johannesburg was another world, bigger, noisier, meaner. The mines ringed the city like open wounds, their dumps rising like unnatural hills. The townships were crowded, always spilling beyond the lines the planners had tried to draw around them. For the state, Johannesburg was an industrial heart that had to be controlled at all costs. For the party, it was a battlefield that could decide the future. For Josie, it was a second beginning. She arrived with a ban on her name and a reputation she did not entirely understand. Word had traveled ahead of her. To some, she was the woman who had dared lead a march and ended up in prison. To others, she was that communist from Potchefstroom, spoken with a mixture of respect and unease. The local party leaders, mostly men, mostly older, looked at her with a calculating mix of welcome and caution. "You've made trouble," one said dryly, when they met in a safe house behind a shop. "The authorities know your name. That is dangerous." "Dangerous for whom?" she asked. He paused, then allowed himself a thin smile. "Good answer. They put her to work." She visited locations where rent was eating more than half of workers' wages. She sat in crowded, smoky rooms, listening to men complain that they were paying for shacks that leaked and crumbled, for streets that were never repaired, for services that never arrived. She listened for hours. Then, when the timing was right, she shifted the conversation. "What if you all refused to pay the increase?" she asked. "What if you paid only what you paid before and did it together?" Rent strikes were dangerous. Evictions could be swift and brutal. But the idea spread, traveling through the same networks that carried gossip and small favors. A pattern began to repeat itself in different corners of Johannesburg. A new hardship was imposed. The party discussed. The men hesitated, calculated, worried about backlash. The women, who could not afford hesitation, began organizing anyway, in queues, at communal taps, in the courtyards where laundry hung, like flags of a country that did not yet exist. Josie was at the center of these webs, but not always visibly. Sometimes, she walked the streets dressed as a domestic worker on an errand, headscarf pulled low, eyes on the ground when police passed. The same invisibility that had once marked her as unimportant now allowed her to slip through cracks in surveillance. Her competitor, meanwhile, had been promoted. He now worked in an office that oversaw native affairs for a wider region, Johannesburg included. He saw reports cross his desk about communist agitation in locations, about rent boycotts, about an unmarried female of about 30 who seemed to appear whenever trouble brewed. He circled that phrase. They still did not know her name. Not yet. The Communist Party, under pressure, also changed. Internal debates tore at its seams. Some argued that the party should focus on white workers, who had more leverage in the industrial economy. Others insisted the future lay with the black majority, whose anger was a tidal wave waiting for direction. Josie watched these arguments with mounting impatience. She saw how some white comrades, sincere in their opposition to capitalism, still clung to old habits of superiority. They were happy to speak for black workers, less happy to listen. She saw, too, how some black male leaders, newly empowered, tried to replicate the same patterns they had suffered under: hoarding information, asserting themselves over women, treating leadership as a prize to be guarded. Leadership, she realized, was another contested space, another place where her competitors' worldview, that power belonged by default to certain bodies, had seeped in, even among those who claimed to fight it. So, when the party called a meeting to elect a new committee to coordinate work in Johannesburg's locations, she went prepared to do something she had never done before. She ran, not away, for office. In a dim hall that smelled of sweat and paraffin, comrades sat on benches, muttering as names were nominated. So-and-so, who had led a successful strike at a factory. Another, who had been in the party since before the Russian Revolution. Names flowed, almost all male. Then a hand went up at the back. "I nominate Comrade Josie," a woman said loudly, cutting through the murmurs. Heads turned. Some men frowned. "Comrade Josie is relatively new," one objected carefully. "She has much to learn." "She has already been to prison," the woman shot back. "That is more experience than most of us want. And she survived it. She has organized women and men. She knows the locations. She knows the passes. Why should she not lead?" The room stirred. Josie stood, heart pounding, feeling again that moment in the street in Potchefstroom when she had stepped out of the crowd. "I don't ask you to choose me because I am a woman," she said. "I ask you to look at what must be done. The state is tightening its hand around our necks. It is extending passes, raising rents, cutting wages. It treats women as an afterthought until we resist. Then it treats us as a threat." She paused, letting the words sink in. "If we leave half of our people in the background, we will lose. We cannot fight a system built on division by copying its divisions among ourselves." There was silence. Then slowly, hands began to rise. When the votes were counted, the result was clear. She had been elected to the leadership of the Johannesburg branch. Somewhere, in an office with polished floors and neatly stacked folders, her competitor scanned a new report. "Subject identified," it read. "Name, Josie Mpama. Known aliases, Josie Mpama. Role, leading member of Communist Party activities in Johannesburg. Particular influence among women. Recommended, increased surveillance, consideration of banning order." His pen hovered. He had no idea that in trying to write her out of certain spaces, he was writing her deeper into history. For both of them, the clock ticked louder. War was rumbling in Europe. New laws were being drafted in Pretoria. New forms of resistance were taking shape in the townships. Josie had stepped into leadership just as the rules of the game were about to change again. And this time, the stakes would include not only her freedom, but the future of a movement that could no longer afford to lose. At first, the most dangerous sound was not the knock on the door or the roar of a crowd. It was the soft, steady clack of a typewriter in an office she had never seen. Each letter hammered her name deeper into the state's memory. Josie, then the slower, colder strokes. Recommended for restriction. Subject, subversive. Subject, organizer. Subject, urgent. While she swallowed dust in township streets, while she raised her voice in halls that smelled of sweat and paraffin, a man with a tidy tie and ink on his fingers was building a paper prison around her, one line at a time. He had 30 days. 30 days, his memo said, to neutralize key agitators before the anticipated wave of mass resistance. 30 days to break the links in a growing chain before it wrapped itself around the country. Josie didn't know about the memo. She knew only that everything suddenly felt rushed, as if the future was sprinting toward her, and she had to decide, quickly, what to do with it. War in Europe had given the state new words: emergency, security, subversion. Those words drifted into Johannesburg like a dark fog, seeping into laws and police instructions. At the same time, the war had given the party a new argument. If South Africa claimed to be fighting fascism abroad, how could it defend fascism at home? Josie walked this contradiction like a tightrope. She spoke at night meetings, where candles guttered in jars and shadows leapt on corrugated walls. They ask our men to fight Hitler, she told miners' wives and factory girls, but they build little Hitlers on every street, dressed in uniforms, carrying passes and guns. We are told we are part of the war for freedom. Where is our freedom? Some women asked hopeful questions. Will things be better after the war? They said. If we help now, will they treat us as citizens later? Josie thought of promises made to her parents' generation. Broken without apology, she thought of the words on that Potchefstroom notice. An entire life reduced to a permit. They will not hand us freedom as a thank you gift, she replied. We will still have to take it. Taking it meant organizing on a scale she had only imagined when she first stepped out of the crowd into the line of police batons. In 1 week, she might walk from Orlando to Alexandra, from New Clare to Sophiatown. Townships hitched to the city like wagons to a locomotive, dragged along without ever being invited aboard. She listened to stories that sounded different in detail but identical in structure. Rent up, wages down, police raids, men arrested for past offenses, women threatened with eviction, children coughing in tin shacks that baked by day and froze by night. The cruelty was not always dramatic. Sometimes it was as small and relentless as a drip on stone. You must pay an extra 2 shillings, a landlord would say. If I pay, we will not eat, a woman would answer. Then go, he would shrug. Knowing there was nowhere to go, Josie took these little scenes and mapped them in her mind, joining them to the larger picture she had started to trace in prison. When she spoke at meetings, she no longer talked only about passes or rent or wages. She talked about the machine that connected them. We are not each being crushed by a different rock, she said, voice hoarse from overuse. We are under the same mountain. The party, feeling the tremors of that mountain shifting, slowly reoriented itself. More meetings were held in locations, fewer in the echoing halls of white workers' clubs. Leaflets were translated, not just into Afrikaans or English, but into Sesotho, isiZulu, Setswana, and on the walls of small, smoky offices, new names appeared on chalkboards. Women's Committee, Location Branch, Youth. In those rooms, Josie's name appeared more often. She chaired discussions. She argued with men who insisted that women would follow automatically if their husbands joined. She pushed for training sessions where women learned to speak from a platform instead of just whispering in corridors. You're impatient, one comrade teased after a particularly sharp debate. I am 38, she said flatly. How long do you want us to wait? Her impatience had a twin on the other side of town. In a building with clean floors and glass-fronted cabinets, her competitor flipped through police reports, lips tightening. Handbills distributed in Orlando, one read, meeting in a private house in Alexandra, attended by approximately 40 natives, many women present, said another. Speaker, female, mid-30s, light skin, educated, possibly domestic servant background. He underlined female once, educated twice. He had sat through enough briefings to understand that older officials underestimated women. They saw them as extensions of men, wives, servants, mothers, not as political actors. He did not make that mistake anymore. Years earlier, He had watched a group of women in Potchefstroom stand their ground in front of a police line. He had seen the look in one woman's eyes, the refusal, the calculation. He could not quite recall her face, but the memory of that refusal stayed with him like a stone in his shoe. Now, reading about this female speaker, he felt it again, that small, irritating pressure. "What is her name?" he wrote in the margin. It took months for the answer to come back with any certainty. "Johannesburg communist known as Josie," one report said vaguely. Another, written with more care, finally offered a full line. "Mpama, Josephine, also uses surname Palmer, active among women in locations. Suspected of promoting non-payment of rents and opposition to passes. Highly mobile. Difficult to monitor." He tapped his pen against the page. Difficult to monitor was a challenge. So while Josie moved through the city, guided by gossip and trust, he began to move against her, guided by maps and orders. Informers were paid. Meetings were infiltrated. One evening, as she stood speaking in a backyard, lit by a single paraffin lamp, a young man near the back shifted his stance just enough to reveal a notebook in his pocket. She saw it flash, saw his hand move quickly, as if by reflex. She faltered for half a second, then continued, forcing herself not to stare. Later, as the crowd dispersed, she caught up with him near the gate. "You took a lot of notes," she said lightly. He flushed, eyes widening. I like to remember," he stammered. "So do the police," she replied, and watched the blood drain from his face. He did not return to the next meeting. She knew that didn't mean he had stopped working. It meant the opposite. Fear had to be managed like any other resource. Too much, and people stayed home, shrinking their lives to the bare minimum. Too little, and they walked into traps. Josie learned to calibrate it, to warn of danger without paralyzing the very people she needed to move. "There will be risk," she would say bluntly. "We know that. The question is not whether they will come for some of us. They will. The question is, will we have done enough before they do?" Enough gained new meaning in the late 1940s and early 1950s, when the state dropped its last pretense. Where previous governments had wrapped their racism in polite phrases, the new National Party government no longer bothered. It announced apartheid as a program, a blueprint, a future. Group areas, Bantu education, native resettlement. Each law was like another bar slid across a door. When the Suppression of Communism Act was drafted, Josie read the summary in a newspaper and snorted bitterly. "This is not about communists," she told comrades crowded into a back room. "It is about anyone who refuses to bow. They will call us communists when we talk about rent. They will call us communists when we talk about passes. They will call us communists when we complain that our children learn more obedience than arithmetic." The act allowed the state to declare organizations unlawful, to ban individuals from attending meetings, from entering certain areas, from speaking in public. It turned her competitor's favorite word, order, into a weapon with almost no limits. At a meeting in his office, he ran his finger down a list of names recommended for banning. Some he recognized from previous reports, known trade unionists and party stalwarts. Others were new to him, younger activists, teachers, clergy. Then he saw hers. Mpama, Josephine, Josie. The line read, "Consider for banning order." Influential among non-European women in urban areas, he made a small mark in the margin. Not yet. She was too valuable. As bait, as a barometer, as a test case. "We should allow some of these people to continue for now," he told his superior. "To observe their networks, a premature ban might scatter them in ways we cannot trace." His superior nodded, satisfied. Josie's name remained on the list, with a quiet circle around it. She never saw that circle. What she saw instead was an explosion of courage. If the state's goal was to terrify people into silence, its laws sometimes had the opposite effect. The brazenness of apartheid shocked even those who had long grown used to injustice. When African children were told they would receive an education designed only to fit them for manual labor and servitude, mothers clenched their fists. When Sophia Town was marked for destruction, its residents watched surveyors like vultures, and something inside them snapped. When past laws were extended, or threatened to be extended, to African women across the country, Josie heard an echo of Potchefstroom in every township. No passes for women, women in Orlando said. No passes for women. Women in the Free State said. No passes for women, women in Pretoria said. The sentence bounced around the country, gathering force. At a meeting in a packed hall, older women who remembered 1913, when women in the Free State had first risen against passes, stood up to speak. "We have fought this before," one said, voice still strong despite the years. "They are trying to bring back old chains with new names. We will not wear them." Josie sat on the platform, listening, feeling history curling back on itself like a whip. "We must not be only local," she said, when it was her turn. "We must be national. They coordinate their oppression from Pretoria. We must coordinate our resistance across every location, every village, every town." That conviction helped give birth to a new force, a federation that pulled together women from different organizations and backgrounds: ANC, Communist Party, trade unions, church groups. Letters were written. Delegates traveled by cramped train and overcrowded bus, sleeping on benches and floors. Petitions were drafted, not in the careful hand of a single leader, but in the collective voice of women who refused to accept their invisibility. Josie, with her experience in Potchefstroom and Johannesburg, became both a memory and a map. On some days, she sat at a table piled with papers, helping younger women turn their anger into clear demands: equal pay, proper housing, no passes. On other days, she boarded trains to small towns, standing in doorways as they rattled through the night, breathing in coal smoke, and thinking of the millions of lives linked by the tracks. She liked the feeling of the carriage floor vibrating under her feet. It reminded her that the country was not static, no matter how many lines the government drew on maps. But every journey was shadowed by time. The women's organizations had set themselves a deadline. They would deliver their protest to the seat of power by a certain date, a day the men in Pretoria still thought would be like any other. Behind that deadline, another one loomed, invisible to most. The state's plan to expand bans and raids once the new security measures were fully in place. "We have months," a comrade warned, "maybe less. After that, they will come for the people whose names are on their lists. Then we must make those months count for years," Josie replied. She worked as if the calendar were on fire. She slept little, ate irregularly, laughed too loudly at small jokes, because the alternative was to let the fear behind her ribs dictate the tone of her days. In crowded kitchens, she practiced speeches with younger women, asking them to repeat phrases until their voices no longer shook. In back rooms, she argued for leaflets to be written in language anyone could understand, not bourgeois democracy and proletarian solidarity, but your rent, your child's school, the police at your door. In drafty halls, she stood at the back, listening as others took the platform, resisting the temptation to step in when they stumbled, letting them find their own footing. "You must be able to go on without me," she told them once, when a particularly intense day ended in exhausted tears. "Why do you say that?" a young woman asked sharply, fear flashing in her eyes. "Are you leaving?" Josie shook her head. "I am staying," she said. "That is why you must be ready, because they will not stop trying to remove me, or you, or the woman sitting next to you. Our work cannot depend on any single body remaining free." On the other side of the city, her competitor stared at a wall covered in maps and pins. Red dots marked locations of meetings, underlined names on cards showed who had been arrested, who had slipped away, who remained stubbornly at large. The pattern bothered him. Despite raids, despite informers, despite new laws, the meetings continued. Leaders were jailed, new ones emerged almost immediately. It was like pressing down on water with an open hand. He needed a different approach. "We must target their ability to speak," he told a gathering of senior officials. "Not just in public, but in private. We must isolate them, make it difficult for them to attend meetings, to travel, to publish. A jail cell is one kind of silence. A ban order is another, more efficient kind." The others agreed. It was cheaper, tidier, less likely to draw international headlines than mass trials. Banning orders could be signed quietly, delivered quietly, enforced ruthlessly. He thought of Josie's name circled on the list. Not yet, he had told himself before, wanting to map her network more fully. Now, looking at the map, he decided the time for watching was over. She had become, in the dry language of his report, a nodal point in subversive activity. In simpler terms, cut her out, and the lines around her would sag. He drafted the recommendation. He argued that given her influence, the order should be as sweeping as possible, restricting her to a specific area, forbidding her from attending gatherings, from entering factories, from visiting certain townships, from being quoted in print. He did not think of it as a personal victory. He thought of it as good administration. The document moved up the chain, gathering signatures like bullet heads gathering powder. Weeks later, as the women's campaign approached its climax, a clerk in a starched shirt carried a brown file into his office. "Your recommendation," the clerk said. "Approved." He opened the file. There it was, her name, the conditions, the thick black lines of legal text. All that remained was the formal signing and the stamping, the ritual that transformed paper into power. He scheduled it for a morning like any other. It never occurred to him that somewhere across the city, that date would land in Josie's life like a dropped bomb. The night before the file reached his desk, she was in yet another meeting. The room was badly lit. Moths battered themselves against the single unshaded bulb. The women were exhausted, but wired, talking over each other, revising plans for the protest down to the last detail. "You will go in pairs," Josie said, tracing routes on a worn map with her finger. "No one walks alone. We know they may block the roads. If they do, you do not push through. You regroup. Our strength is in numbers, yes, but also in discipline." Someone joked about how many times she had said discipline in the past month. Laughter rippled around the room, loosening shoulders, untying knots of dread. She smiled, but the knot inside her remained. Outside, the sky over Johannesburg's mine dumps glowed faintly, as if lit from beneath by some slow, subterranean fire. She walked home with another comrade, their footsteps crunching on gravel. "Do you ever get tired?" the woman asked suddenly. "Not just in your body, here." She tapped her chest. "All the time," Josie answered. "So why do you keep going?" She thought of the typewriters she had never seen, the files with her name in them, the invisible machinery grinding away in offices that smelled of polish and ink. "Because they are very good at turning our tiredness into their victory," she said finally. "They count on us giving up before they run out of ways to hurt us. I refuse to make their work easier." They parted at a corner. As Josie turned into her street, she glanced up at the sky again. It was almost peaceful. Laundry lines sagged between houses. A dog barked half-heartedly and gave up. Somewhere, a baby began to cry, then was soothed into silence. She went inside, noting automatically which doors creaked, which floorboards needed fixing. She placed the bag with her few papers in a spot she could reach in the dark. Years of practice had taught her to live as if a knock could come at any hour. She slept lightly, dreams flickering between Potchefstroom, prison, public meetings, in an office across town, under electric light that never flickered. Her competitor straightened his tie and reached for his pen. The banning order lay before him, waiting only for his signature and that thick rubber stamp. He did not hurry. He liked to be precise. Ink met paper. Somewhere between that moment and dawn, ink became law. He did not hear the dog bark in Josie's street as the first police van turned the corner. He did not feel the air shift as boots hit the ground outside her door, as knuckles lifted to knock with the practiced force of habit. He had already moved on to the next file. For him, it was another tick on a list. For her, it was the last morning of one kind of life, and the first second of another. She had spent years trying to prepare everyone else for, without quite admitting it, might come for her too. The knock was not the loudest thing in the street. The loudest thing was the silence that followed it. The fraction of a second when the whole house held its breath, when even the dog, as half-hearted bark, died in its throat, and Josie Mpama understood with an icy clarity that the state had finally decided it no longer needed to argue with her. It only needed to erase her. She didn't open the door like a frightened person. She opened it like someone stepping into weather she can't stop. Chin up, eyes already measuring the men, the van, the angle of escape that no longer exists. The police filled the doorway with the casual confidence of people who have paperwork. One of them held a folded document as if it were a receipt. Josephine Mpama, he said, mispronouncing the name on purpose, enjoying the power of making it sound smaller. You are served. The paper was thin, but it landed heavy. A banning order, restrictions stacked on restrictions until her life became a narrow corridor. She could not attend gatherings. She could not speak in public. She could not enter certain areas. She could not be quoted. She could not publish. Even her friendships were made illegal by geography. Too many addresses suddenly forbidden. And there, like a final insult, dressed as a clerical detail, the state's time limit. The order would last years, renewable at will. A sentence without a courtroom. Her competitor's signature was on it. Neat, decisive, almost beautiful. They gave her minutes to comply. Minutes to become a quieter person. Minutes to choose what kind of silence she would live inside. In the kitchen, the paraffin smell mixed with fierce sweat and last night's tea. Josie's hands moved fast, not trembling. Years of raids had trained her body to become a machine when panic tried to take the wheel. She reached for the bag she'd placed where she could find it in the dark. A few papers, a pencil, a list of contacts she should not have kept, and yet had kept anyway, because her entire life had been built on refusing the state's idea of reasonable. A policeman noticed the bag. What's that? Clothes, she lied, and watched his eyes flick to the corners of the room. Assessing the poverty-like evidence, they escorted her out as neighbors began to appear, doors cracking open, faces peering. Not a crowd, yet, but the seed of one. People learned quickly what the sound of a van meant. As she stepped into the morning, Josie saw the street through a new frame. Every corner could be a boundary line now, every crossing an offense. The state had not only limited her movement, it had tried to shrink her mind. Inside the van, the metal floor was cold. The men spoke to each other about weekend plans. One mentioned a child's birthday. Their normality was the most obscene thing in the vehicle. At the station, they read the conditions again. Slowly. Like a prayer, they wanted her to memorize. She was required to report, to remain in a designated area, to be alone for long stretches. House arrest, the phrase they didn't need to say aloud. If she disobeyed, she would be arrested, charged, imprisoned. We will be watching, the officer said, leaning in slightly, voice almost friendly. Make it easy for yourself. Live quietly, quietly. As if quiet had ever fed a family. As if quiet had ever stopped a baton. When they released her, it was not freedom. It was a cage without bars. She walked home through streets that suddenly felt altered, not because the houses had moved, but because the future had. She could feel the invisible chalk lines the order had drawn around her feet. She couldn't go where she needed to go. She couldn't stand where she needed to stand. She couldn't do the one thing she had trained herself to do, turn the private pain of women into public power. And then, like a twist of the knife, the day continued. Children ran, vendors shouted, a train clattered in the distance. Life refused to pause for her humiliation. But Josie had never been the kind of person who mistook a pause for an ending. That night, in the dim safety of a back room, a younger comrade arrived with eyes bright from danger. "They've banned you," she whispered, as if saying it too loudly would make the paper grow teeth. "What do we do now?" Josie looked at the girl's face and saw, superimposed, all the other faces, women who had stood in Potchefstroom, women who had learned to speak in Orlando kitchens, women who had written petitions with aching fingers, women who had marched while men in offices timed their courage against administrative calendars. "What do you do?" Josie repeated, soft enough to avoid the walls. "You do exactly what we planned. Without me." The girl's jaw tightened. "They did this to stop us." Josie nodded. "Yes. So we will not stop." She felt the time pressure like a physical object, heavy, pressing down, not the years on the order, the weeks before the next wave of arrests, the months before fear became habit, the hours before people decided the risk was too high. Her life now had a countdown, not because the state had limited her, but because it had revealed itself. It would keep tightening until resistance either disappeared or learned to breathe under pressure. And that meant there was no time left for building movements that depended on one voice. So Josie became something else, a whisper that traveled, a mind that trained other minds. If she could not speak in public, she could teach others to speak so well that her silence would be unbearable to the government. She began to work the way water works, finding cracks, moving through walls. Women came to her house in ones and twos, at odd hours, carrying bread, laundry, a baby on the hip. Ordinary disguises for extraordinary intent. They sat at her kitchen table, while the kettle hissed like a warning. Josie turned the table into a school. "Start with what they know," she told them. "Not ideology, hunger, rent, the passbook, the school fees. The humiliation of being searched in the street. People don't join movements because they love words. They join because they can't breathe." She made them practice, again and again. Stand, speak, don't apologize, don't decorate your anger for their comfort. Don't ask permission to be human. When a woman's voice shook, Josie didn't soothe her. She sharpened her. "Let them hear the fear," she said. "Fear is not weakness. Fear is proof you understand what you are doing. Speak anyway." Sometimes she laughed, quick, almost surprised laughter, because the absurdity of being silenced while her kitchen, filled with organizers, was too delicious not to taste. But the state adapted. The first time a policeman appeared outside her house, leaning against a fence like he belonged there, Josie did not look away. She looked at him until his eyes slid off hers. Then more came. Men who didn't arrest her because the banning order was more useful than a trial. Men who wrote down number plates. Men who followed women after they left her house. Men who wanted her to feel that any visitor was a risk, that her home was radioactive. One afternoon, she saw a neighbor, an older woman who had once smiled at her warmly, turn her head away as Josie passed. It hit her harder than a baton ever had. The state could not force every person to love apartheid, but it could teach them that love was dangerous, that solidarity had consequences. It could turn ordinary people into self-protecting islands. That was the true architecture of the banning order. It wasn't only built to silence her. It was built to make everyone around her complicit in her isolation. And somewhere in a clean office, her competitor watched the reports come in and felt the satisfaction of a plan working. She is contained, one memo said. Limited contact, influence decreasing. He underlined contained and allowed himself a rare smile. He thought he was winning. Then the twist arrived in the form of something he could not file properly. A protest happened without her. A speech went viral through word of mouth, repeated from yard to yard, from bus stop to factory gate. Phrases with Josie's cadence, but spoken by other mouths. Meetings multiplied like cells. When one organizer was threatened, 2 more stepped forward, trained and steady. Women who had once sat in the back now took platforms with a terrifying calm. The competitors' map, once so tidy, began to fill again with pins. Contained, the reports said, yet the movement kept moving. He requested more resources, more surveillance, more informers. He demanded names, but the names he got were unfamiliar. The center had shifted. Josie, banned and boxed, had done what the state least expected. She had made herself less necessary, and yet her own world narrowed further. The years of pressure did what prison had not fully done. They wore her down in smaller increments. Interrupted sleep, constant vigilance, the stress of knowing that one mistake, one meeting, one speech, one step over an invisible border could send her back behind bars. There were moments, late at night, when the house was quiet and the street sounds softened into distance, that she felt the weight of loneliness like a physical illness. Not the loneliness of being unloved, but the loneliness of being dangerous to love. She would sit and listen to the city breathe. Trains, far-off dogs, a drunk man singing himself into oblivion, and she would remember her own earlier hunger for noise, hall meetings, marching feet, the roar of women refusing to be made small. Now she could not even be quoted. Imagine being forbidden to be repeated. The state wanted to cut her out of history while she was still alive, but history has a habit of ignoring paperwork. When news filtered to her, through whispers, through visits carefully spaced, about big national actions, about growing international attention, about women standing up across the country, she felt something stubborn lift in her chest. Not triumph, not relief. Something more dangerous, continuity. She had always feared that banning would make her irrelevant. Instead, it forced her to measure success differently, not by how loudly she could speak, but by how far her ideas could travel without her. As the 1960s arrived, the country's violence sharpened. The state hardened into a security machine with fresh teeth. Raids became routine. Detention without trial became a tool. Whole organizations were smashed, pushed underground, exiled, imprisoned. Josie watched the doors close one by one, and for the first time in her life, she felt the movement itself being forced into the same kind of confinement she had lived in for years. Yet even then, the state's victory was not clean. It was messy, brutal, and expensive. It created martyrs. It produced songs. It made South Africa notorious in the world's eyes. For Josie, the years blurred into a rhythm of compliance and defiance, carefully balanced. She learned how to obey just enough to avoid giving them what they wanted, an easy arrest, and how to disobey in ways that fed the movement, without feeding the police. Small acts, but precise. A message passed through a trusted hand. A visitor told to come at dawn. Leave before the watchman's shift changed. A note memorized, not carried. A young organizer corrected gently, then sent back out into the world with steadier footing. And in the middle of this, the most personal twist: age. The body is the one prison no comrade can break you out of. The years that began with hope and street heat ended with aching joints, lungs tired from coal smoke and stress, eyesight strained by dim rooms. Sometimes she would sit down and feel the chair swallow her more than it used to, as if gravity had become another law passed by Parliament. She had once measured time in campaigns, in deadlines, in the urgent sprint toward a protest date. Now time measured her. She could feel it in her hands when she held a cup, in her back when she stood too long, in the way she needed silence. Not the silence the state demanded, but the silence the body takes. People still came. Less often, more cautiously. Many of the faces were new. They spoke her name with reverence that embarrassed her. "You were there at the beginning," one young man said, eyes wide. "You taught our mothers." Josie's mouth tightened. At beginning, he said it like her real life was already finished, like she was a monument rather than a person who still woke up to fear. "I was there," she corrected. "I am still here." But she understood what he meant. A movement that survives long enough begins to produce elders, living proof that the struggle is not a moment. It's a life. By the 1970s, South Africa's resistance had taken new forms. New generations carried the fight with new language, new energy, sometimes not even knowing the older names that had helped clear their path. The state still believed in its own permanence. It built more prisons, passed more laws, tightened the screws with the confidence of engineers. Josie watched this, and something inside her remained almost calm. Not because she thought suffering was ending, because she had learned that systems that require constant violence to maintain themselves are not stable. They are loud. They are frantic. They are afraid of what happens if they stop. If apartheid ever truly believed it was legitimate, it wouldn't need to ban old women. And yet, even as the country thundered toward futures she would not live to see, Josie's own life moved toward a quieter edge. Not a neat, heroic ending. No dramatic final speech. No cinematic martyrdom. The state didn't grant her that. It preferred its enemies to fade out of view. She grew older under restriction, living with the strange knowledge that the government had officially declared her words too dangerous for the public and then tried to pretend she didn't exist. In 1979, when she died, there was no official admission that a major political organizer had passed. No state acknowledgement that one of the architects of women's resistance was gone. Bureaucracies don't mourn the people they tried to erase, but absence is a kind of evidence. The women she had trained, directly or through those she had trained, carried forward techniques she had insisted on. Speak plainly, organize locally, build discipline, trust women's anger as a political force, never build a movement that collapses when one leader is removed. The competitor, wherever he was by then, had long since filed her away as contained, neutralized, no longer active. In some archive, her banning order probably sat yellowing, its ink still confident on paper, but paper ages badly, ideas don't. Here is the last contrast, the one that should make your skin prickle. The state tried to silence Josie Mpama by making her invisible, by trapping her in a small, frightened life. Instead, it accidentally proved her most radical point, that a woman does not need permission to be political, that a voice does not need a microphone to be contagious, that if you teach enough people how to stand, even a banning order becomes only what it always was, a piece of paper trying to outweigh a human being. And somewhere, long after the men who stamped her name into files were gone, South Africa kept walking toward the future on roads first, cleared by people like Josie, who learned to fight not only in the streets, but in kitchens, in whispers, and in the stubborn refusal to disappear on schedule.